Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a sort of Pulitzer Prize recap for the 2022 prize. Just some thoughts and additional things about this year's prize. I was originally going to lump these into a Friday Reads video, and then I thought I had enough of them to do its own video. I was originally going to call this Pulitzer Prize Hot Takes, but they're not really hot takes. They're tepid at best, and some of them aren't even takes. Some of it is conversation about thoughts that I've been having about this year's prize and why it may have gone the way that it did, or why it didn't go any other potential way. I'll also talk about the books that I would have named as finalists based on my reading of the books from last year, and I'll mention some books that I still want to read from last year that didn't win but still might be worthy, and why not be completely irresponsible and just recklessly speculate about some books to watch for that might be contenders for next year. It's really early to be talking about that, but why not? So we'll get into all of that, as well as some disturbing facts about the Pulitzer Prize, which we will also get into. The first thing I want to talk about is an extension of a conversation that came from my video about the 2012 Pulitzer Prize controversy, where there were 3 finalists for the prize for fiction, but none of them won. There was no winner that year. And if you want to watch that video, I'll link it down below. I'm going to talk a lot about the essay that Michael Cunningham wrote for The New Yorker. It was a 2-part essay. And if you want to read that article, check out the video. It's linked in that, and I talk about it at great length in that other video. So feel free to check that out. But in that essay, in which Michael Cunningham explained what the jury had been thinking and how they had arrived at the decision, and how disappointing it was for them that there was not a winner, despite the fact that they did what they were supposed to do. They named 3 finalists, they submitted them to the board. He talks a lot about flaws that he saw in the 3 books that were named as finalists, and he also kind of explains why he thought they were still worth being finalists. And what's really interesting about that is it gets at the idea of how difficult it is to choose a best book in a given year. And this is something that comes up a lot in this type of video. I feel like a lot of the time people get upset when you acknowledge that there are politics that go into major book prizes, or that there may be considerations other than what is a good book. But I think that's the reality. All of those things come into play, because even taking politics out of it, simply thinking about it as what is the best book is extremely difficult. My pick for what the best book of the past year is will probably be very different from your pick for the best year, which will be different from another person's pick. And maybe you're someone who reads a lot of science fiction, and I'm not. So already, your definition of what the best book is going to be very different from mine. So you can't really objectively answer the question, what is the best book of any given year? One of the things that Michael Cunningham talked about in that article was how he and the other jurors had to align their different interests as a reader and think about what they wanted the prize to represent in that year. It seems clear, given that the 3 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction this year were relatively unknown books, it seems that this year's jury really wanted to elevate lesser-known authors and books rather than focus on titles that people already knew about. So that's probably why you aren't seeing finalists like The Great Circle or The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, and you're seeing books that hadn't really been talked about widely yet, and hopefully will be now. That's something of a conversation I've been having with people in the comments on my reaction video to the Pulitzer Prize announcement for 2022, which I will also link in the description box down below if you would like to check it out. Not a lot of people had read this book yet. There were actually a couple of people who commented that when I did my Pulitzer Prize prediction video, I talked about the Netanyahus, and they mentioned that they had sought it out because they thought it sounded interesting once I talked about it from that video, which made me feel really good. So thank you to anybody who said that. But anyway, it seems like most people hadn't read it, but they were interested in reading it. A lot of people reached out to their library and managed to find a copy. They found a bookstore near them that had a copy sitting on the shelf. And I feel like that is probably what the point of this year's prize was for the jury. That's a book that a lot of people would not have found had it not won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And now a lot of people are seeking it out actively, going to read it and engage with it and start conversations about it. And I think that is probably what the jury wanted to do. They didn't want to throw another recommendation on top of a prize. Of course, I'm speculating. I don't really know. But it seems a little pointed that the 3 finalists were all relatively obscure books. And although I was very upset for The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, which was the book that I was rooting for, I am someone who really likes using book awards as tools for discovery. That's why I love following the long lists for the Booker Prize, the Women's Prize, and things like that. I like going through the list of titles that made it onto those lists and seeing if there are any books there that I hadn't heard of and that I'm really interested in. And sometimes I go out and grab those books immediately. Sometimes I wait to see what makes the shortlist and what kind of conversation other people start having about those books. But to me, that is the exciting thing about it. So I can't really fault the jury for wanting to give people that experience when that is what I look to book prizes to do. The Pulitzer is a bit of a difficult or different case than the Booker or the Women's Prize because they don't announce a long list in advance. They don't even announce the finalists in advance. You just find out what the finalists were when the prize is announced. There's maybe 5 seconds of suspense when you know what the 3 finalists are at most before you find out what the winner is, and that's it. So that whole process of discovery is really limited to just the announcement. So I have a copy of the Netanyahus on order. I know a lot of people have managed to get a copy through their library or grab a copy before their local bookstore sold out. And I can't really fault the jury for wanting to do that. I think it's a noble goal. And from what I've heard about the book, it seems like it's at least a good book. And I am interested in reading it. So it'd be interesting to get around to that. Another interesting thing that I wanted to talk about here is that an article went up that is an interview with ABC News and Joshua Cohen, and the headline of it is, "Prize-winning Netanyahu's author says it's also about Trump." And then the subheading on the article is, "Joshua Cohen, who won the Pulitzer this week for his novel The Netanyahus, says he had another famously divisive political family in mind when he wrote it." And that is an idea or a notion that hadn't really been mentioned in any reviews of the book that I had seen or that I came across really quickly when I was doing my reaction on Monday. And it also adds a layer to the idea that this is a book that the jury would have really wanted to get in front of people, or what would have made it timely or urgent for them, because it has that recent urgency about Trumpism in this country, but it also has that historical context with the Netanyahus, which is really interesting. And I will link the article down below if you'd like to check it out. I will just read a quick piece of it right now so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. But Joshua Cohen, the book's 41-year-old author, says the novel is about identity and illiberalism, fathers and sons, autocrats, and politics as entertainment, and that he had another recently dethroned leader in mind when he wrote it. "I wanted to write something about what it felt like to live in the Trump years," he told the Associated Press in an interview in Jerusalem. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, like former President Donald Trump, comes from a family that became essentially a reality show family, Cohen said. "We were living their show, and so I thought that if I looked at the origins of this authoritarian figure reality show as it developed in another country, it would be possible to say certain things about liberalism and about what it meant to be free and to think freely in a culture where you're bombarded with this spectacle." And he talked a little bit about how the novel is, quote, "loosely based on a real-life visit by Ben Zion Netanyahu, a medieval historian and the former prime minister's father, to the United States around 1960. The story on which the novel is based was related to Cohen by the eminent literary critic Harold Bloom, who hosted the real-life Netanyahus. Netanyahu showed up for a job interview and lecture with his wife and 3 children in tow and proceeded to make a mess," Cohen writes in the author's note. Skip a little ahead. Benjamin Netanyahu was a young boy at the time and is a minor character in the novel, which focuses on Ben Zion and the narrator, a fictional professor of American history named Reuben Bloom. The novel paints the Netanyahus as a crude and brash lot who crash into the Bloom family's quiet life in a quaint college town. And then if we skip ahead a little bit, Ben Zion, a respected if controversial historian of the Spanish Inquisition who died in 2012 at the age of 102, espoused a bleak worldview in which Jews are perpetually at risk of another Holocaust, their best hope being a militarily strong and uncompromising Jewish state. But he was politically sidelined in the early decades of Israel's existence and toiled away in obscurity at American universities, instead investing his hopes in his sons. "It's in these father-son relationships that these authoritarians get made," Cohen said, comparing the elder Netanyahu to Fred Trump, the real estate developer and father of the former president. And then quickly skip ahead a little bit. Benjamin was first elected prime minister in 1996 as a staunch opponent of the peace process with the Palestinians, returned to office in 2009, and went on to become the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. His long rule ended last year, but he is eyeing a comeback even as he is on trial for corruption. Netanyahu was a close ally of President Trump and emulated his style of rule. He presented himself as the only leader capable of shepherding Israel through dangerous times, dismissed critical media coverage as fake news, and accused law enforcement of waging a witch hunt against him. I won't go any further than that. I've read a large chunk of the article to you, but to me, that is something that actually really makes the Netanyahus even more interesting and something that I'm kind of looking forward to now, whereas I would not have looked that closely at it without this award that it had just received. So let's leave the Netanyahus behind for a moment and talk a little bit about the Pulitzer Prize. And first, let's do what my finalists would have been if I was a magical one-person jury for the prize this past year. I would have selected 4 finalists for the prize, and they would have been The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Fanon Jeffers, Matrix by Lauren Groff, The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., and Zorri by Laird Hunt. If the board had told me that I could only submit 3, I might let go of The Prophets and just keep Love Songs, Matrix, and Zorri, but I would feel really bad about letting Prophets go. So in my world, I would have 4, and that's what they would be. And those 5 books are going to factor into the next thing I want to talk about, which is 5 great books that were contenders for the Pulitzer Prize this year, which didn't win. Obviously, the first one is The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Fanon Jeffers. This is the book that I was rooting for. I was halfway through it. I put it down to return it to my library, and I am going to be getting the paperback of it hopefully tomorrow. It was released in paperback on Tuesday, and Montana Book Company put it in the mail for me. So I'm hoping that it will be here tomorrow, which is Thursday, and I will be able to finish it. But it's such a good book. It is the book that I would have chosen for the win. So you couldn't go wrong with picking it up now that it is in paperback. Another great book that didn't win is The Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, Matrix by Lauren Groff, which would have been a finalist for me, The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., which would have been a finalist for me, Zorri by Laird Hunt, which would have been a finalist for me, and then I'm just going to give a quick shout out to Infinite Country by Patricia Engel. I didn't include it in the 5, but it was really close. I almost made it 6 just so I could include it, and I guess I kind of am making it 6 at this point just so I can talk about it. But that is another really great book that you couldn't do wrong by picking up if you are looking for more great books that could have been contenders for the Pulitzer this year. In terms of contenders that I have not read yet, I thought it would be interesting to talk about the 5 books that are probably most urgent on my TBR, or pile of possibilities as it is. And of course, The Netanyahus by Joshua Cohen has to be the first one that I talk about there because it did win and I haven't read it and now I need to catch up to it. The Trees by Percival Everett, because I feel like that seemed like a really strong contender. He was a finalist for the prize last year. I've heard really great things about him since he was a finalist last year, and I look forward to giving him a try for myself. Gordo by Jamie Cruz, which is a short story collection and it has an LGBTQ framing, which of course immediately grabs my attention, and I am still very much looking forward to reading it. The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris. I believe that was longlisted for the Booker Prize last year, did not make the shortlist, and kind of quietly disappeared after that. But it's something that I was just recently reminded about and would like to get to as well. And Hell of a Book by Jason Mott, which was the National Book Award winner for fiction last year, and which was probably a contender, or in contention to some degree, for the Pulitzer this year, but obviously did not win. And then I guess this would qualify as the sort of not hot takes, the tepid takes, if you will, that just came out of the Pulitzer announcement. First is that Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead is probably still in the mix for the Women's Prize now. I had speculated that if it were to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, that would probably ultimately damage its chances for the Women's Prize, because sometimes major book awards don't like awarding the same book that somebody else has already gotten their hands on. So it felt like Great Circle winning a Pulitzer would have been a great thing for Maggie Shipstead in one regard, but it also could have hurt her chances with the Women's Prize. I'd say now she is definitely in the mix for the Women's Prize, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with that prize, because it's kind of the end of the road now, for real, for Great Circle. It hasn't won any of the other prizes it's been up for, including the Booker Prize last year. It was shortlisted for that. So this is really Maggie Shipstead's last gasp to win something for Great Circle. And we'll see what happens when that is announced, I believe, in June. The main thing that I am celebrating after the Pulitzer Prize announcement on Monday is that I don't have to pick up No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood again. I don't have to finish that book. I never have to think about it again. If it had won, I would have felt obligated to pick it back up and finish it, but I DNF'd that book last year, and I am perfectly fine leaving it at that. So the Pulitzer jury and board didn't do a dirty deed for me, and I can just leave that book in the rearview mirror and forget it even exists, which is a relief. On a similar kind of mean note, I can continue my streak of avoiding new Jonathan Franzen books. If he had won for Crossroads, and it did feel like he was at least in contention for it this year. A lot of people liked Crossroads, and he sort of avoided a publicity tour, so he didn't really put his foot in his mouth the way he has with some of his other recent publicity tours. I started and bailed on both The Corrections and Freedom, so I've just avoided any other Jonathan Franzen works. But if he had won, of course, I would have needed to pick it up because of my Pulitzer Prize for Fiction project, where I'm trying to read all of the books that have won this prize. Also significant from this year is that there was no second prize for Richard Powers, Elizabeth Strout, Anthony Doerr, or Louise Erdrich, and there was no third prize for Colson Whitehead. A lot of sites had kind of leaned on predicting that they could have won for their novels that were released last year. I still think it's a hard road for somebody to win a second Pulitzer, even though Colson Whitehead recently did it. It's just not really done. There are only 4 people who have done it in the past, and Colson Whitehead is one of them. So there were no repeat prizes this year. And since Anthony Villasna did not win a Pulitzer for his story collection After Parties, it means that we are not going to be adding another posthumous winner of the prize to the list. I believe there have only been 2 of those. John Kennedy Toole, who had committed suicide before A Confederacy of Dunces was even published. In fact, his inability to get A Confederacy of Dunces published was part of what drove him to suicide. And James Agee died before he could finish A Death in the Family. In fact, there is a bit of debate about how much of the book that was published was James Agee's creation and how much was the creation of the person who edited it. There are 2 versions of the book that are out there, but we'll get into that when I do a future Pulitzer Prize deep dive on that book whenever I get around to it. Another interesting bit of trivia for this is that Joyce Carol Oates and Russell Banks continue to be the Susan Lucci's of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, but both of them do have books coming out this year, and we'll talk about their books later. They have both been finalists several times in the past, but have not won. And then the dark news about the Pulitzer Prize. I looked into some statistics, and it appears that it still is really not easy for a Black author to win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So far, there have only been 4 in all the years that the Pulitzer Prize for fiction have existed. Only 2 Black women have done it, Alice Walker and Toni Morrison. And honestly, if you ask me, Toni Morrison is someone who deserved to win 2 or more Pulitzer Prizes for fiction, and she didn't. She only got the 1. And there are only 2 men who have done it as well, James Allen McPherson for his story collection Elbow Room, and Edward P. Jones for The Known World. I should mention Alice Walker's was for The Color Purple, and Toni Morrison's was for Beloved, but I feel like their Pulitzer Prize wins are probably more memorable, or at least remembered by more people, than James Allen McPherson or Edward P. Jones, although I've heard really great things about Edward P. Jones' book, The Known World. Alex Haley was awarded a special citation for Roots, but he did not win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. We'll get into it that year. Ultimately, there was no winner in the category, but your spoiler alert for that Pulitzer Prize deep dive is that there were accusations of plagiarism levied at Roots that happened maybe a day or 2 days before the Pulitzer Prize was going to be announced. So he had probably been selected as the winner. And again, this is speculation because we don't really know. He had probably been selected as the winner. And then when the plagiarism allegations were made, they decided not to award a prize and give him a citation instead. That is likely what happened. I am going to be doing more research into that once I get around to discussing that year as part of my project. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, only 4 Black Pulitzer Prize winners for fiction and a special citation in the category. And that's it. that's not really great. And for that matter, 2 seems to be the magic number, because 2 black women, 2 black men, and only 2 Latinx winners, Oscar Higuelos for The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love and Junot Diaz for The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Only 2 Native American authors have won, N. Scott Momaday and Louise Erdrich. And then we lose the 2, and there's only 1 Asian American writer who has won, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who won for The Sympathizer and is actually currently on the Pulitzer board, although he may be getting termed out soon, because I think Michael Cunningham said that Pulitzer board members serve for 3 years, and Viet Thanh Nguyen would be in his 3rd year now. So he may be getting cycled out, or he may continue, I don't know. And then further digging into the numbers, only 31 women have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction out of, I believe, 95 winners. I did a quick count, so my numbers might be off a little bit but by 1 or 2 in either direction. But on a quick count, there have only been 31 women who have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction out of 95 winners. So it's still a prize that is dominated by white men, and I do hope that the Pulitzer will do better on that in the future. And now let's talk about any 2022 releases that you might want to watch out for going forward. The first one is something that I have read already. It's Don't Cry for Me by Daniel Black. I loved it. It's going to be one of my favorite reads of the year for sure. I will talk about it more in June when I do my best reads of the year so far, and definitely one to watch for, because I'm going to be talking about it nonstop. I don't know if it will actually be a contender in book awards or best of lists once we get to the end of the year, but I would love to see it happen. So I'm just going to try to manifest that out into the world and put it out there that I think it should be a contender. Then we get to Joyce Carol Oates and Russell Banks. As I mentioned, they are starting to turn into the Susan Lucci's of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Joyce Carol Oates is extremely prolific, so it's not really surprising that she has another book coming out this year. But when you look at The Babysitter, it sounds like a book that could potentially grab the Pulitzer board's or jury's attention. I'm going to be doing a video soon where I talk about upcoming releases that I'm really excited about, and I'll talk more about it then, as well as The Magic Kingdom by Russell Banks, which is coming out, and which also sounds like something that could really catch the Pulitzer jury's attention. Other things, To Paradise by Hanya Yanagihara. Hanya Yanagihara is a very love her or hate her author, but all you really need is at least 1 or 2 members of the jury who are in the love it camp for her to be in the mix for To Paradise, which is also a divisive book, just as A Little Life was a very divisive book. I think A Little Life is more divisive than To Paradise has been so far, but we'll see how that conversation develops over the rest of the year. Still, it seems like it would have to be in the conversation for now, at least. And then a book I was looking at called Notes on an Execution by Dania Kukavka, which just kind of flew under my radar, and people mentioned it to me a couple of times, and I recently looked up what it's about, and it sounds really fascinating. So that could be a contender, as well as Groundskeeping by Lee Cole, or The Candy House by Jennifer Egan. I am not sold on that one as a contender, but I feel like I should mention it because she is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And again, it's really hard for people to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes, but it is an extension of the universe that won her a Pulitzer Prize, which makes it a sort of interesting thing to watch as the year continues and we get into book awards season. I'm also not sold on Emily St. John Mandel as a candidate, but she did release a book called Sea of Tranquility, and the TV adaptation of Station 11 seems to have pointed a lot more people in her direction. So we'll see how that goes throughout the year. And 2 books coming out. Barbara Kingsolver has a book coming out called Demon Copperhead, and George Sonder has a story collection called Liberation Day. It's been a while since a story collection won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but if anybody can do it, George Saunders probably could. And I would love to see Barbara Kingsolver in the mix. She's an author that I have enjoyed, and The Poison Book Bible is a fantastic book that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So it would be interesting to see her in the mix again. And if you have other books that you'd like to throw out there that are released in 2022, put them in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think about anything I've talked about here. And I look forward to continuing the conversation about the Pulitzers, maybe not this year as much anymore, but I look forward to looking ahead to 2023 and future winners and more deep dives and all of that stuff. And if you've made it to this point, thank you for that. I appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.